Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I take a look at Quicksilver. I would have gotten this video out earlier, but ironically enough, his potential was very slow, so I wasn't able to test him at tier 4 the week that he came out. So I had to take a little bit longer so that I could actually test him in Alliance Conquest at tier 4. That's why I'm releasing this video in the middle of the week. By now, a bunch of you have likely picked up the uniform if you play PvP, or if you haven't, you've likely faced off against him in things like Alliance Conquest or Otherworld Battle. Regardless of whether you have him or not, I break down my testing for the character to basically determine what potential builds are most ideal for him and potential teams to use him on, since he seems to be pretty fragile defensively but very strong offensively. All the testing that I did in PvE is done without a damage proc, and all the testing that I did in PvP is done with a brilliant CTP of Authority. Keep in mind that I did test an Invincible Obelisk with Guard Break immunity first, but upgraded to the Brilliant Authority to see how far I could push his survival with that CTP. Because there is a bunch of PvP testing to cover, I'm going to be running through the PvE part quite quickly. Like many of the other characters, the first test that I did was to take him into a stage 24 of Null without using a leadership or support or a damage proc, and he did quite well. He was able to complete the fight with about 2 minutes left. If you plan on using the character specifically for PvE, you definitely can make something like a CTP of Energy or a CTP of Destruction work. He is fairly proc friendly, though you do have to delay cancel the third skill a little bit, but the skills preceding that in the rotation don't have hits right away, so you definitely can make an Energy or Destruction function. However, if you plan on using the character for things like ABX or maybe the ABL day that has no restriction, then a CTP of Rage would be the most ideal there, since it seems to work better in that mode. You can see that even at level 70, this time with a leadership and support and without a damage proc, he was still able to complete stage 49 with about a minute left, meaning that he could go to higher stages if the restrictions allowed. Once I got the character to level 80, I reran the stage 24 and stage 49 tests with the same conditions. On stage 24, he saw about a minute and 30-second improvement, and on stage 49, with the supports and the leadership, he got about a minute and 40-second improvement roughly. I also took the character into stage 79 of Ultron. Unfortunately, I did end up dying at the 15 health bar mark, but it doesn't really matter because the point of the test is to show how much of an improvement it makes going from level 80 to tier 4. And just to be clear, at level 80, he can definitely clear this even without a damage proc. Probably would have completed it with a little under a minute left. If or when you get the character to tier 4, he does get a pretty substantial stat bump. He gains about 12,000 physical attack and about 36,000 HP, which definitely should help him out, since survival is kind of his weak points when he's facing metas in PvP. In terms of the strikers for PvE, just go with the standard most ideal options there, which would probably be Thor or Ghost Rider. For PvP, you want to go with strikers that match his instinct and have ignore iframe on them, so that would be characters like Jean Grey, or the best option would be Wolverine. However, in PvP, it's not too likely that Quicksilver will survive to the tier 4 skill, so you can pretty much use whatever you want. Ideally something that has iframe ignore on it, but doesn't have to be those two characters. With the tier 4 upgrade, Quicksilver is able to complete stage 49 about a minute and 10 seconds faster than before. On stage 79 of Ultron, Quicksilver gets to that 15 health bar mark about a minute and 20 seconds faster than before, and is able to complete the fight entirely with about 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. So taking that difference into account, he likely would have completed stage 79 at level 80 with roughly around 30 seconds remaining. So you can obviously see that his offense is pretty good, especially for a character that doesn't have a damage proc on. You won't really be using Quicksilver in ABX or ABL. In ABL, he doesn't really have a specific day that he satisfies, and in ABX, there are better options even for the speed hero day that he does satisfy. Besides that, he doesn't really have all the cancel effects needed for the different seasons. He has paralysis in his kit, but for ABX specifically, he doesn't have burn or silence. With that said, the character does well in these modes because he has a high hit count, and you can cancel a lot of skills into one another to gain a lot of chain hit. You can see from this that I was able to score around 8.3, almost 8.4 million, even though I wasn't able to cancel the Frost Beast's debuff effect, so I probably would have been able to score closer to 9 million if I could do that. With the tier 4 upgrade, you will get a significant bump because you can keep getting even more hits with the striker coming out, and I was able to increase my score by around 1.7 million, though do keep in mind again that I didn't cancel any of the Frostbeast's debuff effects, so that probably would have been closer to 11 million, and if I had a damage proc, that would easily go past 12 million or even more. The rotation that I used for the character was to use the 5 cancel into 3. You delay cancel after you see a little bit of the green aura appear on the 3rd skill, and then immediately go into the 4th skill, which is the one that you want to proc on. When you have your ultimate, you can do a 4 cancel, 5 cancel, 3, delay cancel, and then finish off with your ultimate, since it has 100% increased damage to that skill when you use it. I initially tried delay canceling the ultimate into the 4th skill, but the damage proc is too difficult to pass off, and I found that that was significantly worse than just finishing and proccing on the ultimate skill instead. Again, you can see that the character still does quite well at level 70 without a damage proc, since I was able to solo Dormammu with about 6 minutes and 30 seconds left. When you have access to the tier 4, you can basically use that right away just to get the striker damage out there and activate it as quickly and as frequently as possible. With that tier 4, I was able to complete Dormammu about a minute and 30 seconds faster. So I extensively tested Quicksilver in both Timeline and Alliance Conquest, and I found that his toughest opponents were Wolverine, obviously because he has that immortal effect and has the type advantage versus him, as well as pretty high burst if the opponent has a CTP of Greed equipped to him. And the other one is Silver Surfer because he has those 2 lives. He has the iframe ignore counter that knocks Quicksilver out of his iframe and then just makes him take a ton of reflect damage from all the AoE skills that he has on the field already. You'd think that you could just equip a CTP of Conquest to solve that problem, which you technically can, but oftentimes Quicksilver isn't really too susceptible to reflect because he is in full iframes from his 4th and 5th skill. It's only really versus Silver Surfer that knocks him out of that and has reflect that is kind of an issue. And even then, you kind of have to take a large number of hits and that top proc for the CTP of Conquest to be active for you to be immune to reflect at the exact moment when you get knocked out of the skill, so it's not really too ideal. Besides these 2 characters, obviously the other top metas that he occasionally struggles on are Sentry because he is very tanky and has a lot of iframe ignore, Adam Warlock because most times players have a damage proc on him, so on his 2nd life he can potentially one-shot you, and characters like Thanos who have a lot of survival, a lot of tankiness, and can potentially also one-shot you with that 1st skill that removes all your buffs and can hit you very hard if there are other skills on the field as well. Besides that, the character does have a lot going for him, at least offensively. Like I mentioned, the 4th and 5th skill are full iframes, so the opponent absolutely needs iframe ignore to be able to hit them, especially because the AI prioritizes the 4th skill first, which is great because it also has the iframe ignore, and then often goes into the 5th skill right after and cycles between those 2 skills exclusively. The 3rd skill rarely gets used unless he gets knocked out of those skills for whatever reason. The other benefit to the 4th and 5th skill is that they both have super guard break on them, meaning that the character will immediately lock down the opponent if they don't have any kind of protection against this. And with the 5th skill being an AoE, that means that he is quite beneficial in modes like Alliance Conquest or Otherworld Battle where you're facing multiple opponents at once. In addition to this, the character also has 70% penetration to all sources natively, meaning that he will rip through Invincible, and because he has such a high hit count on the 4th skill, which essentially got doubled from the last uniform, and because it oftentimes gets layered with the 5th skill, that he will also go through a lot of hit shields fairly quickly. Keep in mind that he will also get 50% increased attack because of the 4th skill activating right away and the buff that's associated with it, as well as damage accumulation that follows right after with the 5th skill. And oftentimes most of these hits will connect because he has 50% ignored dodge in his kit as well, which effectively is like having a portion of the CTP of Greed in his stats. The chain hit on his uniform passive and the high skill damage and bonus damage also ensures that the 4-5 combo will more than likely be able to shut down and take out opponents. And as you can see here, the main point that I'm trying to make fighting all of these metas without a damage proc is to show that the character can definitely function and does quite well even if you don't use something like a CTP of Greed, CTP of Destruction, Energy, or whatever other kind of proc you might want to equip on the character. As you can see, the character's offenses are obviously more than good. The main issue with the character is that he is essentially a glass cannon because his survival is so lackluster. He's missing a lot of the mechanics that make many of the top metas so good defensively. He only really has 45% guaranteed dodge in his kit for survival, and besides that, just a heal that he can spam on his 4th skill, as well as debuff removal, but not debuff immunity. The 3rd skill can give him invincible, but he hardly uses it, and the 4th and 5th skill being full iframes would be good normally, but with so many metas having iframe ignore or iframe ignore counter, it doesn't really provide too much of a layer of protection. Obviously, if you can get his artifact, it definitely does help improve his survival, but for a character that has 1 life, he should be much closer to how Thanos functions, where he is a little bit of a nuisance to take down, especially considering that he is a native character, unlike Spider-Man, who technically in some ways can be tankier than him, even though he isn't a native character. Even if they gave him something like 20% damage reduction as opposed to the 30 or 40 that some of the other metas get, it would go a long way, since you can potentially stack it with the steal effect as well as other supports. But on top of that, they really should consider giving him something like either a barrier hit shield or potentially some kind of super guard break immunity when he's in his 4th skill at least, so that his main skill doesn't get interrupted. Or potentially even add another new mechanic for speed type specifically, since they struggle so much having no damage reduction and simply relying on dodge to survive, which is pretty much a coin flip and oftentimes leads to the characters being inconsistent in their survival, because sometimes they can end up being quite difficult to take down and other times they just end up dying almost immediately. Because of the inconsistency that the dodge provides in terms of survival, you could potentially opt to put a CTP of Authority or a CTP of Conquest on Quicksilver and potentially help the part of his kit that's struggling, the survival. Obviously, because his offense is already good, that's what I decided to do with a brilliant CTP of Authority, though again, this doesn't necessarily guarantee that he will survive the 2nd life of a revive character or potentially the immortal proc, the artifact of those characters, but it kind of helps him out where he is struggling. You could also go with a CTP of Greed if you don't really think that that's helping, and potentially go all in on just taking out meta characters or wiping them out in things like Alliance Conquest. Especially characters like Thanos, this is very beneficial, since you will guarantee, especially if you have the universal proc first, that you will basically one-shot him as opposed to him surviving with his health procs and stuff like that. In terms of the option between a CTP of Authority and a CTP of Conquest, I kind of went with a CTP of Authority for the reason that I mentioned, that the 3rd skill doesn't really activate too often, so he essentially doesn't really have Invincible, and any character with no penetration can essentially take him out, so that helps him there. You can also stack up damage reduction with a passive from a support character, as well as the top proc from the steal effect activating, so that kind of helps him there, gives him some damage reduction on top of the occasional healing that he uses from the 4th skill and the dodge layers that he has on top of that. With most characters' kits coming out, I normally would have gone with a CTP of Conquest for Quicksilver, but the only real protection that you get from that is the hit shield, and because he doesn't have any damage reduction natively in his kit, he doesn't really activate Invincible, he doesn't have a hit barrier, you're really just left with the damage reduction from the wall proc activating, and any character that basically has or doesn't have penetration in their kit can still hit him and get that reduced fairly quickly. On top of that, you don't really benefit from the healing too much from the wall proc. You obviously benefit when it activates on the 4th skill, but he doesn't have any other sources of healing like characters like Spider-Man, for example, have when they activate the emergency heal when they're at low health, or any other characters that have multiple healing across different skills. This isn't to say that you can't use the CTP, you definitely can. I just opted with the CTP of Authority for the reasons that I mentioned. You could obviously also leverage something like a CTP of Refinement or even a CTP of Regen, especially a CTP of Regen with penetration, where you could try to interrupt the opponent when they interrupt you so that you can go back into your skills. However, like I mentioned, I'm not sure that that would add too much survival to the character, because again, you're trying to leverage the healing from his kit, and that's mostly just centered around the 4th skill. If you play the character on manual, you essentially want to use the same rotation the AI does. You go with the 4th skill first, so that you have the iframe ignore, you have the super guard break, and the full iframe. You don't want to go into the 5th skill right away after the 4th skill, because if the opponent ends up dying, then you're stuck with no high damage skills like the 4 and 5, and you won't really have any iframe to protect yourself. You can see that a lot of this fight is reliant on the luck of the guaranteed dodge and the artifact protecting me against hits, and also from the steel CTP of authority being up at the same time so that I don't instantly end up dying. But basically, more often than not, you just want to do a 4 and then slightly delay cancel into the 5th, so even when that finishes, you can go back into the 4th skill. On the Alliance Conquest side, I initially tested Quicksilver at level 70 with just an invincible obelisk. I was mainly trying to show that he doesn't need a damage proc to be able to take out some top meta characters like Madeline Pryor, Black Swan, or even Adam Warlock. The main issue that he has is obviously his defenses and not his offenses. More often than not, his 4th skill will activate right away, even though it does show a little bit of a wind up. It seems to have a higher priority than most other kind of quick burst skills, with some few exceptions. And he will frequently be able to take out the first life of revive characters, but it's the second life where he kind of struggles and usually ends up dying. You can see in this clip that he is even able to take out Thanos without a damage proc, and again at level 70. Ironically enough, at tier 4 I wasn't able to take out Thanos. It really depends on what character that 4th skill hits, especially if it hits Hela, then it will miss Thanos and he will use the first skill to take him out. But you can see that even though Quicksilver did end up dying, Echo with a similar kit was able to survive, which shows you the inconsistency of how the dodge and survival mechanics for speed characters work. In terms of the most ideal team for the character, I found that using Echo's leadership to give you ignore dodge, give you attack, debuff leadership, and defenses is the most ideal for Quicksilver, and then using a support to boost up both of those characters really helps out even further, especially if that support character can provide survival for those two. Unfortunately, you can see that this is kind of a bad matchup for Quicksilver since he has difficulty with the reflect from Silver Surfer, but it also shows you that he is able to take out characters like Carnage even when Carnage has those supports and Quicksilver still doesn't have a damage proc. You can see from this fight that even if a character has a type advantage versus Quicksilver, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will hard counter him. Because he has so much damage from his kit, he can potentially burst those characters down, again, even without a damage proc, and because he goes into the 4th skill so quickly, he can lock them down and prevent them from just one-shotting him right away. It's also worth noting that you don't necessarily have to use the support as an offensive option. You can use it as a defensive option so that the opponent can't use things like supervillains versus you, or has to use a character like Molecule Man to remove that support from boosting up Quicksilver and Echo. You can obviously see that Quicksilver is definitely not bad for Alliance Conquest, and with very little effort, just using Echo for leadership and a support, you can take out a bunch of metas with him, and you don't really even need any kind of fancy CTP or big build on him. Since I showed at level 70, you could also take out meta characters even with an invincible obelisk. I also wanted to see how Quicksilver stacked up versus one of the top PvP characters in Timeline and Alliance Conquest, that being Sentry, so I took him up against a solo one, and he seemed to do well even though Sentry has that super guard break immunity. Naturally, the next step was to fight a Sentry with a Colossus support and potentially another meta, which I did, and he was able to wipe the whole set even without having to rely on a damage proc. The Brilliant CTP Authority wasn't exactly enough to keep him alive, but I did notice that the Invincible proc does help him versus Sentry specifically. Because Sentry opens with his 2nd skill, he doesn't get penetration until he goes into the 5th skill, so you potentially have a protective layer at the start if you kind of get knocked out of your skill, allowing him to go into his 5th skill or other skills to be able to hit other opponents. I don't think any CTP will really be able to make him tanky, but I found for my purposes that the CTP of Authority was the most effective. Quicksilver essentially is kind of a wild card, as you can see from this clip. He was even able to take out Wolverine because he can leverage going into that 4th skill that basically keeps Wolverine from going into his 5th skill to take out Quicksilver immediately, and because of the high damage, he is still able to take out both of those characters and wipe the set, even when there is Colossus support on the team. So that is basically Quicksilver. I don't necessarily think that you need him at tier 4 to be able to use him effectively in PvP. As you saw, even at level 70, I was able to take out some big metas, even without a damage proc, which I keep mentioning because I think it's pretty cool. But the only problem is that his survival is fairly lackluster, and you will probably die regardless of what kind of build you use. The main benefit of the tier 4 I find is that you can kind of leverage the survival option a little bit more since you have the extra health. You also have the extra attack, so you don't necessarily need the damage proc. However, if you don't have a fully maxed out build, either on your account or the character, you can probably leverage a CTP of Greed and not have to worry about him wiping out full teams in Alliance Conquest. I still think that Quicksilver and speed types in general kind of need a buff to their survival since damage reduction is usually omitted, so they probably need some kind of new mechanic or something to help with that, because being so inconsistent in their survival, especially for native characters, isn't really ideal. One potential mechanic for speed types specifically that don't have damage reduction, for example, could be that if they are in their iframes, they take half the number of hits from the opponent, so effectively they get a type of damage reduction that is specific to them. Hopefully this is one thing they look at when they review Deadpool and give him his new uniform. They should not only give him the immortality effect either by reworking his artifact or by adding it as a passive to his latest uniform, but also considering either damage reduction to his kit or something like what I mentioned. That pretty much does it for this one. One of the other reasons why I mentioned that you might not want a tier 4 Quicksilver right away is because with the next update being centered around the Fantastic Four, it seems very likely that Doom may also get a tier 4, and with just a single uniform, he became meta when that came out, so it's very likely that he will be very powerful when he gets another uniform, an artifact, and a tier 4. But yeah, we'll have to see what happens with that. Either way, if you enjoyed this video, found it entertaining or useful, make sure to like, subscribe, and possibly share it with others. As I've mentioned, it could help them out, and it always helps my channel grow. I appreciate people taking the time to watch these videos. Thank you, but the video is now over.